Assalamu alaikum. So today I want to talk about what could be a very controversial topic, and that is the topic of child marriage. And I know there's a lot of things that could be said about that, but I want to address this because this verse here in chapter 65, verse 4, so Surah At-Talaq, verse 4, is often given as a justification for the permissibility of child marriage. And I know there's a lot that could be said about this topic, so I know the reflections I'm gonna give on these verses today don't cover everything, right? So I know that going into it, this is a big topic that we can talk a lot about. However, at the same time, the Qur'an was simplified for us. It was made easy for us. So on the other side of that, this should be something that we can look at these verses in a really easy, simple way and see how it doesn't justify that. So I want to just give you a few reflections of why I don't believe these verses justify that. So 65:4, let's read it first, and then I'll explain how they use it to justify that, and then I'll explain why I don't believe it justifies that. So here he says, وَاللَّائِي يَئِسْنَ مِنَ الْمَحِيدِ مِن نِّسَائِكُمْ إِنِ ارْتَبْتُمْ فَعِدَّتُهُنَّ ثَلَاثَةُ أَشْهُرٍ وَاللَّائِي لَمْ يَحِضْنَ. He says, and those women, okay, and those women who have despaired of menstruating. So they have reached the age, perhaps is the meaning that they're not going to menstruate. Min nisaikum. So from your women, those women. Wallahi, the ones who, and then later in the verse he says, min nisaikum, from your women. In irtabtum, if you have doubt. Fa'iddatuhun, then their waiting period is thalathatu ashhurin, is 3 months. Wallahi, and also the ones who lam yahidn, have not menstruated. Okay? So, how people who justify child marriage interpret this verse is the part here where it says, and those who have not menstruated. That means they are pre-pubescent, they're pre-menstruation age. Okay, so that means they're children basically. So they use this verse as a justification to say that therefore you can marry them because it describes a waiting period for them in situations of divorce. So that means they can get married. However, I think that's stretching it because first of all, if we look at the beginning of this verse is clearly referring to nisa, women. Okay, that's number one. Because he says, Wallahi ya'isna min al-mahidi min nisaikum. And those who you have despaired from your women of menstruating. Okay? And then Wallahi lam yahidn. And also those who have not menstruated from your women. So it starts the verse off talking about women. And then, of course, some people might argue, well, who's to define what is a woman? Right? And I would say you're exactly right. And that's the really interesting and important point about this verse starting off using the word women is that the Qur'an, we could say potentially, and this is something we will want to do more research about to be 100% for sure, but potentially the Qur'an doesn't give us a strict definition for women. So therefore, that leaves it open for us to study in each time, in each age, what can we define as a woman. And in the times and the age that we live in, we've learned now how brains develop, how brains mature, and we understand that our brains aren't really fully formed until we're about 25 years old. So even in our decision making, before that, we still have some issues because the parts of our brain that are involved in that aren't fully formed, right? So with what we know now, to use a verse like this to argue in favor of child marriage, especially what we know worldwide for like certain the studies that have been done in regards to this, the harm that it causes, I think is misguided. So I think the fact that this verse starts off referencing women is a clue that we have to think about maturity in every time and every context that we live in and not just apply this based upon how someone might have understood it 1,000 or 1,500 years ago. Now, the other thing about this is if you apply this verse, one way logically to understand the fallaciousness of a certain argument is to take it to its extreme conclusion. So if you take an argument to its extreme conclusion, and that extreme conclusion is ridiculous or is not supported, then that's an indication that the original argument has some flaws in it. So if those who have not yet menstruated refer to the permissibility of marrying um, uh, girls, basically children, right, who have not yet menstruated, then in that case the verse doesn't give us a limit to that. It could be any age then, right? That's from the verse because it doesn't give us a limit. It just says those who have not menstruated. So keeping with that logic, then um, that logic is refuted by chapter 4, verse 4. So chapter 4, verse 4. I'm sorry, verse 5. No, verse 6. I was close. Third time's the charm. Chapter 4, verse 6 says, وَبَتَلُوا الْيَتَامَى حَتَّى إِذَا بَلَغُوا النِّكَاحَ, and test and try the orphans until they reach an-nikah, until they reach marriage or marriageable age. So when you put the two verses together, when it says وَاللَّائِ لَمْ يَحِضْنَ, and the one that has not yet, and the one that has not menstruated, if you apply that as meaning you can the permissibility of child marriage before menstruation, and you say that there's no limit on that, then what does this verse mean? That it tells us to test and try orphans until they reach an nikah, until they reach a marriageable age. So there is a time period in their life when we would consider this the age of nikah, and before that we wouldn't, right? And then further the verse continues, وَبَتَلُوا الْيَتَامَى حَتَّى إِذَا بَلَغُوا النِّكَاحَ فَإِنْ آنَسْتُم مِّنْهُمْ رُشْدًا, and test and try the orphans until they reach the age of marriage. فَإِنْ آنَسْتُم مِّنْهُمْ رُشْدًا, then if you perceive and see from them maturity, فَدَفَعُوا إِلَيْهِمْ أَمْوَالَهُم, then give them their wealth. So even when it comes to the control of their wealth, two stages are mentioned here. They reach an-nikah, they reach the age of maturity, or I'm sorry, of marriage. So there is an age that is considered the age of an-nikah, and before that it's not. But even then, the Qur'an doesn't tell us to release their wealth to them if we're caretakers of their wealth. It says, فَإِنْ آنَسْتُم مِّنْهُمْ رُشْدًا, then if you see maturity from them, فَدَفَعُوا إِلَيْهِمْ أَمْوَالَهُم, then in that case give them their wealth, right? So even with the distribution of their wealth and the handling of their finances, you have to have these two stages. The second of them is that you have to see maturity in being able to handle things. So how is it we think that we can apply that with wealth but not with marriage? That they don't have to reach a certain age of nikah, and then after that still we have to perceive from them the proper maturity. So I think when you put these verses together, instead of taking the first one that we talked about in chapter 65 in isolation, this sheds a lot of light on the topic. And then if we compare this to other verses, because here it just refers to the orphans when they reach an-nikah, but other verses use actually a different term. So other verses say, like in 6:152, وَلَا تَقْرَبُوا مَالَ الْيَتِيمِ إِلَّا بِالَّتِي هِيَ أَحْسَنُ, and do not approach the wealth of the orphan except with that which is most beautiful, حَتَّى يَبَلُغَ أَشُدَّهُ, until that orphan reaches their age of full strength. Ashuddahu. Okay? So when you put all three of these together, you start with the first verse in 65. وَاللَّائِ لَمْ يَحِضْنَ refers to women, as in the beginning of the verse. And then you look at the verse about orphans, and it says that they have to go through two stages before you even release their wealth to them, which is reaching an-nikah and perceiving maturity from them. And then you go with this verse, 6:152, and there's a few others, but we can limit it to this one, that it tells us to give them their wealth when they reach ashuddahu, their age of full strength. When you put all of that together, I think that shows, or at least starts us down the path of seeing why Qur'anically we shouldn't continue to justify child marriage, and Allah knows best. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.